All right, it is time again for the greatest podcast to ever be created around performance engineering in the entire galaxy, and that is the SMC Journal podcast. Of course, I'm a little biased on that. I'm Scott Moore, and I'm your host, and I really appreciate you joining me for today's episode. This is a precursor to our next podcast, which is a conversation with the one and only James Pulley about the subject of Apdex, or the Application Performance Index. What is it? We're going to get into that today. I felt like before we got into the conversation with James, who basically goes into his experience with Apdex, how he feels about Apdex, is it useful today? Is there a better way? Before we kind of dive into that conversation, maybe for some of you who don't know what Apdex is, we should do a little deep dive in researching what it really means, and where did it come from? Why is it used? Why do we care about it as performance engineers? So that's really what we want to get into today, and that kind of will provide us the context of the next episode. Now, before we do that, let's also mention our wonderful sponsors that make this show happen, shall we? This episode is sponsored by Micro Focus and the LoadRunner Solutions family. That includes LoadRunner Professional, Enterprise, Cloud, and Developer. You know, performance matters. Did you know that LoadRunner Solutions have the largest community of practitioners in the world? Join that community at community.microfocus.com, scan the QR code, and check out the LoadRunner family page on performance engineering, as well as their YouTube playlist that we've got links for in the show notes on smcjournal.com, as well as YouTube. This episode is sponsored by Stormforge. The Stormforge platform focuses on AI-powered software designed to help DevOps teams release with confidence and help your IT leaders realize the promise of cloud native. That means faster innovation, higher quality, resiliency, scalability, and efficiency. Find out more at stormforge.io. This podcast is sponsored by Orasi Software. For over 20 years, Orasi, a DevSecOps innovator, has helped companies innovate, accelerate, and automate the entire software development lifecycle. Orasi AppSec and Orasi Cloud Solutions and Services offer full lifecycle support and integration to ensure scalability of transformative applications. Also, the makers of Orasi Labs is a train anyone, anywhere, anytime AWS Cloud Native virtual e-learning platform. And Orasi works with hundreds of global brands as customers and partners. That includes Fortune 500 companies, and that's across a variety of industries. Find out more at orasi.com. Thank you, our wonderful sponsors who support the performance community, and thank you for joining us for the show. Now, let's dive into Apdex. What is Apdex? The Application Performance Index. Now, that's not just some made-up term from some vendor. This was actually created by a user group called the Apdex user group, and it has become a standard over the years as a sort of a high-level service level agreement metric or indicator that can be provided to basically address end user experience and their delight or frustration with a web-based application. So it's end user facing, and that's a real thing to key in on. Let's just talk about the group. I've got the page up here. If you go to apdex.org, you can find out more about the Apdex user group. You can find out how this became a standard and how it defines a method to report and rate application response time for a lot of things. It's a standardized way to report end user experience by converting many metrics into a simple 0 to 1 score, which I'll show you in just a moment. Who are some of the known Apdex adopters or the companies that actually use it? We can see here some of the companies we would suspect. That includes CatchPoint, Datadog, Dynatrace, New Relic, Raygun, SmartBear, Splunk, VMware. I mean, these are the list of usual suspects that we would have thought would be reporting this on their APM product. But now what we have to ask ourselves as performance engineers is, great, I see that it's out there, I see other people using it, but how useful is it, and what is its usefulness, and are there any downsides to it? Why do I really care about that as a performance engineer? A high-level SLA and metric to me it sounds like something that I might want to report on a dashboard for executive or managers who don't really want to dive into the details. And as we performance engineers know, the devil is in those details. So when you report something back, anything back to management, and maybe the indicator is that things aren't so good, good leaders are going to say why, and then you're going to have to basically drag them in and be able to explain why, which means you're going to have something to support this metric that you're using, and you'll have to know sort of the good and the drawbacks of reporting such a metrics to your organization. So I found a couple of articles, and you're going to notice several links on this episode in the show notes. And we put those on smcjournal.com for this episode as a blog post. And then we also put the notes with all the links in the YouTube video description as well. So you can get to those. And I really wanted to share this. I'm not going to go through every single one of the links that I provided. There's quite a few of them. But I wanted to go over some of the major ones here for the time that we have. Excellent article here that I found on Raygun's website. Let's go to that. And it talks about just basically a guide to how calculations are made, what the score is used for. It's a fairly new article from March of this year. Talks about what it is. Now, here's the thing about Apdex. You have what's called the satisfied user, a tolerating user, and a frustrated user. And the goal of Apdex is to try to let you know, in general terms, how well is your application being received by end users. Are they thrilled with the performance time, or are they frustrated? And if they are frustrated, the more chances are they're going to be abandoning your site, which means, especially if you're selling something on that, you're going to be losing revenues. And there's all kinds of studies out there that prove that faster websites have more conversions and make more money. And the other thing that you want to do is make sure that if you're able to scale this and support a lot more users with the same performance time, that it still has a similar cost. In other words, you're not spending so much more money just to scale things out. So Apdex doesn't necessarily address the cost of keeping that score in the satisfied range, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. So we talk about how Apdex works. There is this concept of something called T, the letter T, which I'm just going to call that an acceptable transaction response time from an end user perspective. I go to your website's front page, however long it takes for me to render and interact with me, that's going to be what is my tolerance level for that? You see a lot of studies from vendors like Google and Facebook, Apple, and others that mention how fast a website should be. When we talk about frustrated users versus satisfied users, okay, that's not an exact metrics, because what is acceptable for me might not be acceptable for somebody on a mobile device who's doing something, or a gamer who's requiring something that may need a lot lower latency than what I might require if I'm just perusing an informational website. So I think context is really important there. But this T is something that you as an organization have to define. If we say that 3 seconds is the acceptable response time for our page, maybe we're a retail site, and we know that once we get above 2.4 seconds, that we start seeing more user abandonment, more user frustration, and as that increases to 6 or 8 seconds, we lose so much conversions that it's actually costing us money. I've heard that called the performance poverty line. When you hit that particular line where you're starting to lose, you can actually show that you're losing money, you've got to speed up that site. So if 2.4 seconds was that, we might say 3 seconds and under, we know we're going to have satisfied users because they're still engaged. They're still buying things, right? What Apdex does is say, okay, if you've set the metric of T, or the acceptable transaction time, to 3, then there will be a measurement of that which is tolerant of a little bit beyond 3. And then when you go to 4 times that amount of T, which would be 12 in this case, that is considered a frustrated user. Now, as you set T to be higher, that 4 times gets to be very large as well. So if we said 5 seconds was the tolerance for a web user on a 4G LTE connection, so that means 20 seconds until a user is frustrated. So this is where some performance engineers kind of say, I'm not sure that that's a great calculation or way to create that calculation. I found on CatchPoint's website, they actually have a nice article on it, which lists out the formula. And we should probably do that now that you know that this scoring is based upon satisfied, tolerating, and frustrated users. The performance index metric is the total number of samples. Let's say the total number was 100. That would be the number on the bottom, in this case, on the right. You would take the number of satisfied requests that you've gotten where you know it was 3 seconds or less. You put that number, let's say that 33 out of 100 were satisfied requests. And then you had tolerating where you had another 33 out of 100, or 30, let's say 34, because we're going to divide that by 2. So 34 would go in the tolerating. You divide that number by 2, you add them together. Now you've got that number left over total samples. That's what your score is going to equal. And this is what it looks like as a graphic. We have this score range that goes from 0 to 1.0. So we've got unacceptable to poor, based on that score that we just said of how we're dividing, all the way to 1. So if none of the requests that you have are acceptable, in other words, all of them are frustrating, all your timings are 12 and higher, you're going to have a score of 0, obviously. If every single one of the requests are 2.5 seconds and under 3, you're going to have a score of 1. And obviously that's what you want, but that's not life, right? It's going to be something in between because you can't control last mile, network latency, trips around the world, physics, hard stuff like that. So you're going to have something in between. Now, the real question then becomes, how useful of a metric is this? So what are some of the downsides of reporting such a metric? Well, obviously, and I like the way that CatchPoint actually describes it in their article. Apdex is great if you want to talk about things that are so general, such as, I want to know what the weather is outside. I go to my phone, partly cloudy and 89 degrees. That may be all that I need to tell me it's okay for me to go outside without an umbrella. What that metric doesn't tell me is, it doesn't tell me where that 89 degrees came from and that 10 miles over it's 5 degrees cooler because it's at the beach. It doesn't tell me how many clouds are actually in the sky. It doesn't tell me how many people are actually out there in the world underneath that sky and how many of them are really, really hot, how many of them say, I like it hot. So you're not going to get that kind of information out of a metric such as this. So when you report this metric on an APM dashboard and a manager sees that and says, you know what, it says that we have an unsatisfied user out there, or people are just barely tolerating our applications. Why? I want to know why. So this is where good observability and good service level objectives definitions really come into play, so that you can not only have you've devised what a good number for T is, and remember, T for your main marketing website out there may not be the same T as a critical application that you're working on for healthcare vertical, right? Or a financial vertical of stock trading. Those T's have to be tuned. So, but even at that, if that number is off, you're going to need to dive into that, and you're going to need to map the other metrics that you typically would look at to find out, why would a performance time be unacceptable? Of the ones that we're seeing of those requests who are not meeting the satisfactory, or they're barely even tolerating, why is that so? and without really good observability and being able to dive into those requests to find out, oh, well, the reason why these users are unsatisfied is because of the connections they're actually using. Or maybe we've got an office, maybe it's an internal application, and it's one particular office that is reporting this because the office is somehow misconfigured. I heard about one incident before where there was one particular remote office reporting in terrible response times for a SaaS application, but everybody else is fine. Well, what's unique about this? They have the same type of laptops. They have, networking. They're supposed to be physical connections. Well, when they fly somebody in and look, they find out that yes, people are coming into the office. This was back when people actually came to the office. They plug in their laptop into a docking station. That docking station has a physical connection to it, which would be the highest performing network connection they had in the office. However, those weren't turned on and nobody knew. So the secondary connection would be Wi-Fi. Well, they only had one Wi-Fi router in the office. It wasn't performing very well. And when everybody came into the office on a particular day and logged in a particular time, they were all hitting this poor performing Wi-Fi router who was crumbling under the load that it was getting. Other days when very few people came in, the office was fine. So it was reporting under certain times of one particular office, one particular portion of time. So a metric like Apdex is not going to catch something that specific. You'll need to dive in and do that. So another thing is that it doesn't really count the outliers that are in, and the outliers are where investigative work really needs to be done to find out, is it something out of our control or is it something that we can actually do something about? At the end of the day, what we want to think about is when we pull samples, we want to look for patterns. And really what we want to do is look for that T for tolerance. I call that acceptable transaction times that are under that. And F for frustrated. We want to stay in the satisfied zone if we can. And if we can't, we're definitely going to have some tool that's going to allow us to find out why. For a company like CatchPoint, this makes total sense because they are tracking end user response times. The digital experience monitor is really what they care about, which is also why they own web page test, which is where people would go to put in their information on their URL and get timings about their web page, how long it takes to render, look at things like the core vital metrics from Google, and improve their site over time. So it all kind of works together. So Apdex is just really one score. One other good source of information was New Relic. So if you look up Apdex and you look up scoring and you do some research, just a few Google requests, you'll come up with documentation from both Datadog and Dynatrace, but also New Relic. And New Relic actually has a calculator out there where it will let you go in and use some of these samples where it's pulled these sample times to check your work on how you're creating this metric and find out how well you're doing on that. So they actually have this. I think this is also a GitHub repo where you can actually download the source code for this, if I'm not mistaken. This is just a demo of that calculator, and it's newrelicuniversity.github.io. Of course, I'll share the link with you on that. So is Apdex the only standard performance metric out there? Well, not the only one. Probably the most common one for an SLA of that type. I mean, you also have Google Core Web Vitals that everybody is kind of looking at today, and that's not even the only one that's out there. One company in particular that I want to talk about is Akamai. All right, several years ago, we're talking 8 to 10 years ago, there's a company called Soasta, and many of you, unless you go back that far, after about 2015, 2017, you're probably not hearing much about Soasta, so they've kind of gone off into they've ridden off into the sunset because they were purchased by Akamai, mainly for their Impulse product, which was a real user monitor that they had where they could get that information from real user sessions. So instead of just getting synthetic monitoring from a script, they're actually getting real user sessions, and they're getting the Google Lighthouse metrics from that And that was one of the reasons why they were purchased. And believe it or not, Soasta had a performance testing product as well. They probably still do. You just don't really hear a lot about them in the market. And I do remember there is a video on YouTube, and I actually have the link to it, where Buddy Brewer was talking about a different index calculator. And he was actually, the title was at the Velocity conference. And he was talking about, what about going beyond Apdex? Is there a better metric? Well, they thought so, and they had actually come up with their own, and it was called the Consumer Performance Index, the CPI. And if you look out there, there's actually a patent that Soasta had actually applied for to create that calculation. They had a website where you could go in, very much like Web Page Test, put in your web URL, and they would calculate your index and basically give you sort of a swinging pendulum between, nope, your user's already going to be abandoned, your site. No, didn't really go into much more information than that. You can see a small demo on Buddy Brewer's his talk at Velocity. It's only about an 8-minute video. I think it's just highlights, but they talk about how, nope, the user's already gone. They're there, but you need to get a little better, and then you're doing great. So it was kind of similar, but they had a little bit different play on it. Well, what I thought was, well, surely Akamai would take that CPI and bring it into the fold after they had purchased Impulse. And I also assumed that the RUM values would also be reflective of Google Lighthouse values. But I'm finding that that's not the case. Number one, if you get past 2015, you're really not seeing a whole bunch of articles that even talk about the CPI, even though in 2015, it was a major press release for Soasta. So if you know any more about that, I'd really be interested to find out what happened to the CPI. If it was important enough to have a patent on it, why did it go away, and why are we still not hearing about it from Akamai? Akamai, if you're out there, I'd love to talk to you about it. Here's a website from Akamai, a blog post, and this is from May of 2021, and it talks about comparing perceived performance metrics. This is from Will Smithy, who says he's been asked multiple times if the impulse time to interactive, the TTI, and time to visually ready, TTVR, are the same as those that Lighthouse, Web Page Test, and Speed Curve use. The short answer is no. Now that actually surprised me. So they talk about how their real user monitoring measurements and their synthetic measurements actually work, and he goes into some detail here. He actually has a chart here between what Impulse shows and what Lighthouse and Web Page Test and the others actually use, and how their speed index algorithms actually work. So I thought this was very interesting. I think you should go through it and read up on it, because there are many people who use Impulse, and Akamai is also known as one of the leaders in CDN performance and other things around gathering things like real user measurements, RUM. So being one of the leaders, I want to know what they say about that and how they calculate those times and how they think those times are better to report than, say, something like the CPI now, or that they used to have, and Apdex now. So I felt like that was curious. So I want to know more about that. So the bottom line is, Apdex is a score that can be used to report a very high level metric, very much like a short weather report. But you're going to need to dive into those details if you're a performance engineer working on performance, or if you're an SRE and you're having to look at an observability platform to find out, how well is my application doing? How well is my service doing? You are going to have to look at those outliers, and so you still need all of that. How are you using? I would really like to know how some of you are using Apdex. Are you trying to follow it the best you can? Is it a useful metric for you? It would be great if you give me some feedback on that. I'm very easy to find on the web. You can reach me at scottmoore.consulting. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and my Twitter handle is loadtester. And of course, you can always reach me at help@scottmoore.consulting. If you like this kind of video, then it would be great if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel and keep everything going. It lets me know that I'm on the right track, and I should keep releasing these podcasts. Now, next time the next episode, we're now leading into this conversation with James Pulley that I had. So keep in mind how he feels about it, because he's actually, he's done the work. He's gotten feedback on several projects where they were using Apdex and had questions about it. And in some cases it has worked, in some cases not so much. And James has another set of metrics that he really likes to use. So I'm interested to hear what you feel about what he has to say in our next podcast. So I can't wait for you to see that coming up in just a few days. Thank you again for watching the show and making it happen. Thanks again to the sponsors. And for this episode of the SMC Journal, this is Scott Moore saying thank you for watching, and bye-bye.